One of the difficult balances that has to be struck is sort of maintaining security, but also not taking away the rights that people have as Americans. And sometimes this can be a struggle. There are some exceptions to a lot of the constitutional amendments that we've already reviewed. Um, there are some cases in history where the Supreme Court and other federal courts will allow the government to sort of infringe on people's constitutional rights a bit if there is an immediate danger to the public or national security is threatened for the entire country. All right. So just some historic examples of this. In 1865, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in the border states. We previously talked about what habeas corpus was. And generally, he was able to do this because there was a time of rebellion going on. Right? And if you remember, the border states were states that remained loyal to the Union, despite the fact that they were located in the South. And there were many people within these states that were trying to get the states to secede and fight with the South against the North. In many cases, Lincoln, because he suspended habeas corpus, had people that were protesting against this in one of these border states in the red to fight with the South against the North to be arrested and imprisoned. And because habeas corpus was suspended, he didn't have to inform judges of why he was doing what he was doing. If he had to have done that, obviously judges wouldn't be able to keep them detained, those individuals, because they weren't actually committing a crime. So this is one example. 1942, President Roosevelt ordered the internment of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. These internment camps, basically under the premise that it would be impossible to tell a loyal Japanese American from a potential Japanese spy, so that many Japanese Americans were forcibly detained and forced to live in these internment camps for a portion of World War II. The Supreme Court had justified that this was a lawful measure for Roosevelt to take, although looking back on it, obviously it's one of the darker moments in American history because the object, at least from the court's eyes, that Roosevelt was trying to protect the country. In 1996, the government took some sort of liberties with how they conducted the immediate investigation following the 1996 Oklahoma City bombing of the federal building in downtown Oklahoma City by the individual on the right, Timothy McVeigh. And they were able to get around some of the provisions within the Bill of Rights because of the necessity to capture him before he carried out anything else related to this. Or in 2002, following 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act, which was meant to sort of better protect the country against future terrorist attacks. And many of the elements of this law were pretty controversial because people looked at it as infringing upon their constitutional rights. Government officials being able to wiretap your phones without a warrant if they felt like it would prevent an immediate terrorist threat. The ability of government officials to be able to access your medical records without a warrant, or your internet search records without a warrant, or you can read sort of the other things that it would sort of allow. But this was an example of a law that was sort of infringing on some of these constitutional rights in the name of sort of national security, public safety, those types of things. The courts have actually ruled on this. A case of New York Times versus Corliss in 1984 did admit that there was a public safety exception to some of these Bill of Rights amendments, right? And you can see this reflected in a 2010 FBI internal memo. If applicable, agents should ask any and all questions that are reasonably prompted by an immediate concern for the safety of the public or the arresting agents without advising the arrestee of his Miranda rights, sort of going along with the Supreme Court decision that, you know what, sometimes there are exceptions to some of these rules. And if there is an immediate danger, an immediate threat, that law enforcement might not have to take the time to read Miranda rights if the threat was that imminent. So it is important to note that there are exceptions. And again, you see this in certain circumstances. In 2013, the infamous Boston Marathon bombing, the suspect, when he was detained, you can see him in the photo, was interrogated without his Miranda rights or a lawyer being present. And there were searches throughout the Boston area without a search warrant being issued. And all of these things were deemed to be not unconstitutional because of the concern for public safety. Were there other bombers out there? Were there other bombs that were set to go off that you couldn't sort of like delay the sort of investigation by having to go through all these other extra steps? And there are certain circumstances in which the government could probably do a bit more in terms of infringing on your constitutional rights because public safety or national security is sort of like jeopardized.